If you would, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter number 11. Just want to read one verse to you. We're going to look at a whole bunch more, but just starting off with just one verse here. And this is kind of our launching pad for the message this morning. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 1, these words spoken by Paul, he's talking to his people. And he's giving some fantastic pastoral advice. And he's telling them this: be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. So Paul is telling his church members, if you want to finish your race, keep your eyes on me. And the reason is because I'm keeping my eyes on the Lord. And so let's take a look this morning at the subject, the treasure of our heroes. When I was a child, I can remember having two heroes that I got off the television. The first was, they were both Western related. The first was a gunslinger by the name of Paladin. If you remember that guy, Have Gun Will Travel. Man, I liked that guy. He was always wearing black. And so to be like my hero, I didn't have any black shirts, but I got some of my dad's electrical black tape, and I started wrapping my arm in black to make myself a black sleeve. Well, by the time I got down to my wrist here, my hand was swelling up and it was throbbing like crazy, not getting any blood to it. So I had to take all that tape off and I had to find a new hero. And that's when my eyes fell upon the Lone Ranger. And I'll tell you, he was a guy that I really, really liked. The reason they called him the Lone Ranger was because he was the only one that survived an ambush. Six Rangers, Texas Rangers altogether. All five of them got killed. The Lone Ranger was the only one left. He was shot, dying, and an Indian by the name of Tonto came upon this almost dead guy. And as Tonto nursed him back to health and that sort of thing, they became friends. And after a while, Tonto started calling him Kimosabe. Well, the reason he called him Kimosabe was because the Texas Ranger was looking for the bad guys that killed his brother and those other Rangers. And he was always wearing disguises to blend in. And Kimosabe means he who looks in secret. After he got his health back, the Lone Ranger started tracking down the bad guys, and he caught them and brought them to justice. And then he got to thinking, maybe I ought to just spend the rest of my life doing this. So he got himself a mask, and he was always chasing after the bad guys. And along the way, the Lone Ranger kind of let it be known what his moral code was, because he lived by rules. He was a guy that just didn't wing it. He had some direction and purpose in his life. Some of his rules were to have a friend, a man must be one. Another one was all men are created equal, and within each one of us is the power to make this world a better place. That all things change but truths, and that truth alone lives on forever. And one I liked was, I believe in my Creator. This is the Lone Ranger's code. I believe in my Creator, my country, and my fellow man. So back in the day when I was 5, 6 years old, he was the man. But there's one thing that in having a hero you need to realize, and that is a hero is only one-dimensional. And what I mean by that is heroes are going to have flaws. They're going to have weaknesses. But there is one quality about a hero that just resonates, and that one great quality is what you need to emulate. And so you ought to have heroes in your life with the understanding that every hero is going to have a flaw. So what was the Lone Ranger's flaw? It was a huge one. His flaw was he wasn't real. Made up. Pretend. And so we're looking at some of the heroes that I've had over the years. Never forget that a hero in your life is going to be flesh and blood. They're going to have flaws, so you need to find that one thing, that one redeeming quality. If you don't have it, you need to use that hero to reach out and grab hold of what will make you a better person and a better Christian. Turn, if you would, to Psalm 68, verse number 4. I want to, again, delve into some of the heroes that I have used throughout my ministry, throughout my life. Psalm 68, verse number 4. And the first heroes is, I have heroes who are family. Psalm 68, verse number 4, the Bible there says, Sing unto God, sing praises to his name. Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name, Yah, and rejoice before him. A father of the fatherless and a judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation. Now notice verse 6 here. God setteth the solitary in families. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains, but the rebellious dwell in a dry land. Grown children have developed an obsession for criticizing their parents nowadays. If they got a messed up life, it's my parents' fault. I could have really been a success in life, but I had a horrible childhood. And what they do is they use the parents as the scapegoat to justify their messed up life. A car thief in prison. They're going to claim that, well, while I was growing up, my parents never bought me Hot Wheels, and because I didn't get Hot Wheels growing up, that's why I became a car thief. I'm not a car thief because I'm a bum. It's because my parents, they should have given me Hot Wheels. A serial killer can blame their mom for having their lack of feelings. There's a sociopath because they were bottle fed as a baby instead of being breastfed. And because they weren't breastfed, that's why they don't have any feelings like they ought to. They're not a normal human being because it's mom's fault. An atheist can proudly claim that there is no God because, well, my parents made me go to church when I was little, and they even made me sing out of the hymn book. That's why I don't believe in God right now. It's not because of me, it's because my parents. A homeless person can blame their parents for living under a bridge because they refused to buy them the same toys and same clothes and same tennis shoes as everybody else in school, and that's the reason I have nothing today. It's my parents' fault. The problem with this ever-increasing epidemic of whining about parents and an unhappy childhood is that while they're blaming their parents, what they're really doing is they're blaming God. Because God is the one that chose to put each one of us into a specific home, which is exactly what verse 6 tells us. God setteth. He places the solitary, the individual, in families. And here the Bible tells us that it was actually God's decision to allow you to be born to whoever your parents are. He knew who they were. He knew what they were like, including their weaknesses. And God also knew what you needed to get saved. God knew what you needed to help you to become the right kind of person. And so God chose to put you, each one of us, in the very home that we grew up in. Having said all of that, I want to share with you the reason why one of my family heroes is my dad. After my mom died, I was 4 years of age. She died from cancer. My mom's family started cooking up an idea of how they could take the load off of my dad of trying to raise 4 kids by splitting up the family. And so they were trying to bring this about and trying to farm the kids out to each one of the houses type thing and among the relatives. And they were trying to split up the family. And Dad wasn't going to have it. I had no idea that this was taking place until decades later I found this out. And in spite of that pressure, Dad made the decision that whatever it took, he was going to keep the family together. As an adult, I can appreciate now what it must have been like trying to maintain a career, a job, raising 4 kids without a wife to help out. And while other kids were out of school for the summer, my brother and I were sitting in a public service utility truck. My dad was a lineman, and if he couldn't find a babysitter for that day, we were in the truck with him. And it was hot day after hot day after hot day sitting in the truck with my brother, watching Dad climb electric poles because he couldn't find a babysitter. But he was determined to do whatever he had to do to keep the family together. I can remember one time sitting in that utility truck, and a call came over the radio from my dad. Well, I wanted to help him out. He was on a pole. So I picked up the microphone, and I said, Daddy's not here right now. I thought I did great. Dad got back in the truck, and I told him that there was a radio call, but I took care of it. He wasn't too pleased for some reason. But he was still willing to do whatever it took if he couldn't find a babysitter. Can anybody show me a verse in the Bible that guarantees that children are supposed to have a fun summer? Because I can't. There's this mentality that parents are supposed to turn a kid's life into every day is Disneyland. And the truth of the matter is, God knows what's going to shape us and what's going to mold us, and sometimes that involves not going to Disneyland. Sometimes that involves sitting in a hot truck. Sometimes that involves having to go to the funeral of your mom and grow up for a number of years without a mom. God knows what we need, and for that reason, He placed us in a specific home with specific moms and dads in order to mold us into the person He wants us to be. And God chose to put me in that specific family because there were some things that I was going to experience that would be stamped on my heart, becoming a part of me. And one of the things that I grew up to realize was the fact that my dad was an even better hero than the Lone Ranger, because my dad was real. Remember when I mentioned that heroes are one-dimensional? There's one great quality about them that ought to motivate you. And the reality that there's also going to be some weaknesses. My dad lived to be 96. He passed away. And he had his weaknesses. But I'm not going to tell you what they are. Because he's my hero. And there's some things that he did right. He kept the family together. And he helped me to become a man. For that reason, I refuse to even consider what the weaknesses were of my hero, because I know he's one-dimensional, had his flaws, but he's still my hero. And that is something that every child, regardless of age, needs to do. Every child needs to put their parents on a pedestal, because there's some fantastic and great qualities inside that home. And the children need to quit whining and start looking for that quality so that they can embrace that and use it to become a person that God can be proud of. Turn, if you would, to Galatians chapter 6 and verse number 10. Galatians chapter 6 and verse number 10. The second area that I have gotten my heroes over the years from. I have heroes this morning who are in my church family. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. The Bible there says, "As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. And so what God is telling us is, you know what? You need to do right by people. You need to be good to people, especially if you go to church with them. Church family is being exalted and elevated above physical family. One of my all-time favorite special days in our church, we call it Heavenly Sunday. And Heavenly Sunday is a time where we as a church highlight, mention, pictures on the wall, on our screens, of former church members who have passed away and they're now in heaven. And the reason that I started this special day, we do it annually, the reason I started it was because when I came to our church 35 years ago, I inherited these people. I inherited the facilities. I didn't have to go out and start a church. I inherited a church. And during the course of those 35 years, there were people in the pew that were helping me. As a brand new pastor, I needed help. I needed people to come up and lie to me saying, "Preacher, I really enjoyed that sermon." I needed it. I needed people to follow me. And there are people that in our church that helped me to become a pastor. When they passed away, I had the privilege of preaching their funeral, and I preached dozens of them over the years. And I'll tell you something that I did every time I preached a funeral sermon for one of our people. I looked into their life, and I found at least one quality that made them a hero to me. And because of that, I looked into our pew, into our church, and I realized that I was surrounded by heroes. Church members who loved me, church members who followed me, church members who helped me. A number of months ago, my wife and I were visiting my stepmom. She's in a nursing home in Columbus, Indiana. And while we were there visiting with her and chit-chatting and talking, one of the nurses came in and told her, and said, "Hey, you got a piece of mail. Somebody sent you a letter." Well, she's in her 90s. She can't see all that good. So my wife decided to open this up and read it to her. And it was a card from one of my church members, ladies. My mom's been to our church half a dozen times. And one of the ladies in our church sent her a card in a nursing home. Hadn't been to our church in years. And so my wife is reading this card, and it's not some printed words and then a signature. This lady wrote a half a page talking to my mom. And I thought to myself, how in the world could she be so thoughtful to write a note of encouragement to my mom, who she's not seen in a couple years? The lady that wrote the card, she's one of my heroes. And you know what? She probably has some flaws, and I don't want to see them. I don't want to know about them, because she's my hero. She went to the trouble, the expense, the time to write some words of encouragement to a woman in her 90s, can't hardly see anymore, and it made my mom's day. You know what? That's what heroes do. They do things that are unexpected. They do things that are a part of them. And the truth of the matter is, this woman who wrote the card, that's what she does. She's just obsessed with sending cards to people. And that's her ministry. She embraced it herself. She started it herself. Nobody told her to do this, but over the years, that's just what she does. She writes letters of encouragement. She sends them to people. And that's something that's a blessing to them. Now, here's the great thing about pastoring this church for these many years. Because as their pastor, I can go from pew to pew, person to person, and I can tell this is what they're good at. This is what this person excels at. And what that means is, my church is not unique. There's heroes in this church, in every pew. There is something that you're good at that God can use to be a blessing to people. There are some ladies who love to cook. Somebody gets sick, they go to the hospital and that sort of thing. They just go into the kitchen, whip something up, take it over to them. What a blessing. Probably about a year ago, I went to visit one of the ladies in our church. She had just lost her husband. She's losing her sight. She was kind of a shut-in for a while. We've got her back riding a bus to our services again. But she was at a time when she was just really trying to deal with the loss of her husband. She's losing her sight. She was having some health issues and that sort of thing. I went by to visit her, and the first thing that she told me was, "Oh, so-and-so was just here." Well, who's so-and-so? One of the ladies in our church. Well, why'd she go and visit her? Because that's what heroes do. They don't have to get a call from the pastor and say, "Hey, we need for you to make a visit to so-and-so." Well, I'm kind of busy, but I guess I can work it into my schedule. No. A woman in our church knew of another woman in our church who just buried her husband, who was having health issues. And so she just went and paid a visit. Can you appreciate how that makes me as a pastor feel? To see people in our church reaching out and helping people, being a blessing and an encouragement, and I didn't even ask them? Because that's what heroes do. And there are heroes here this morning in every pew. There is something that you can do. You don't have to build a building or frame a wall or hang drywall or do electrical work. You just allow the Holy Spirit to point you and direct you. Because there's people all around us who need some help. They're struggling. And that's what heroes do. They allow themselves to do something to be a blessing to somebody else. Turn, if you would, to Jeremiah chapter 5, verse number 5. Jeremiah chapter 5, verse number 5. Another area that I extract heroes from, and again, I'm using people that encourage me, who motivate me. I have heroes this morning who are preachers. In Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse number 5, the Bible there says, "I will get me unto the great men, and will speak unto them, for they have known the way of the Lord, and the judgment of their God." The great men, not necessarily being famous perhaps. Perhaps these are older, wiser individuals. When I first became the pastor at Temple Baptist in 1988, I did this on purpose because this was a church that had gone through some troubles. A couple of months before I came there was a fist fight out in a parking lot between our church members. That's kind of the condition of the church that I inherited. And so there was some infighting and this and that sort of thing going on. And so when I came here, I was struggling. And so what I did was I remodeled the auditorium and I put on the walls of the church preachers so that our people could get to know them. And I'm talking about old preachers, long dead, D.L. Moody, Charles Finney. And I wanted our people to have an appreciation for preachers, because if they could appreciate preachers of bygone years, they would appreciate preaching, which was going to be life-changing if they would allow it to do so. And so one of the preachers that I had on the wall was Charles Spurgeon. And Charles Spurgeon was kind of one of my heroes. And the reason was not because he pastored a large church, but because of what he had to go through as a pastor. He had some health issues. He suffered from a severe condition of gout. His leg would swell up, he couldn't even walk. And sometimes it would become so bad that he would have to leave his pulpit for 6 months at a time in London. He'd travel to France, Mentone, France, I believe. There were some mineral springs there, and he would try to soak his leg and get some relief from the gout. And he'd be out of the pulpit for 6 months. Then he'd come back. During that time, he also had a wife who was invalid, bound in a wheelchair. So he's, pastoring a church running 5,000 people, but he can't even preach there more than 6 months at a time. And his wife is an invalid. He found great success as a preacher, but he was really going through the trials to do so. Another picture that I had on the wall of our auditorium was that of Billy Sunday. Everybody's familiar with him, had 1 million converts, hit the sawdust trail and all that, but that's not why he was one of my heroes. Billy Sunday was my hero for this reason. He was a professional baseball player who was willing to hang up the cleats and get involved in the ministry, but it was not a ministry of preaching. When Billy Sunday ended up getting saved and he turned his back on Major League Baseball, he volunteered to become the helper of an evangelist by the name of J. Wilbur Chapman. J. Wilbur Chapman would travel around city after city. They'd set up a tent, outdoor revivals, and Billy Sunday was the one who was arranging the chairs for him. Billy Sunday was the one who was raising up the tent poles. Billy Sunday was the one who was doing all of the leg work, all of the hard work, so that the evangelist could get up and preach. And when God called the evangelist back in to pastor a church, J. Wilbur Chapman handed 10 sermons to Billy Sunday and said, "You got it from here." And Billy Sunday started preaching somebody else's sermons. His success as a preacher is not what makes him a hero to me. The fact that he was willing to go from being a somebody to a nobody, that motivates me. That helps me to keep my head on straight. Another one of my preacher heroes was D.L. Moody. Once he became well known, he was having conferences up in Northfield, Massachusetts, I believe it was. And he'd have these big conferences, and he'd bring in all these big shot preachers, and everybody in the country knew who they were. And D.L. Moody would tell these preachers, they'd be there for maybe a week. He said, "Okay, when you guys get done preaching, at the end of the night, stick your shoes out in the hallway and somebody will come by and shine your shoes for you." And one of the preachers, he's thinking, it's been a couple of nights now. I don't know who's shining the shoes, but I'm going to make sure that I stay awake tonight, waiting for that boy who comes along and shines my shoes, and tell him thank you. About midnight, he heard somebody rustling out in the hallway, opened the door to say thank you to the boy shining the shoes, and it was D.L. Moody, who was going by taking the shoes, shining them himself, and putting the shoes back for the other preachers. D.L. Moody was a famous individual, but he's my hero because he was willing to stoop to the place where he's shining the shoes of the other guest preachers. There needs to be individuals that we find that we can look to for that one great quality. I realize that heroes are made of flesh and blood. I know that they all have issues. They all have weaknesses, but they're one-dimensional, and that means there's one thing that we can find in just about everybody. Something that we lack or we're weak in. And we can allow that person to become our hero, to help us to become a better Christian. Turn, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25. I have another batch that I extract heroes from to motivate me. I have heroes who were athletes. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 25, listen to the words of Paul referencing athletics. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 25, and every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. One of my all-time favorite baseball players is Lou Gehrig. He played with the New York Yankees back in the day when there was a murderer's row and they had Babe Ruth and a host of other individuals. So what was it about Lou Gehrig that I admired? It's not the records that he set. When Lou Gehrig died, they did an autopsy on him. They found that he had 16 different broken bones in his hands over the years. And this is the guy that set the record for consecutive games played. And what that means is that when Lou Gehrig got hurt, he showed up for work anyway. When he hurt and injured his hand, he kept on playing. He didn't whine, didn't complain. Nobody even knew about it until they did the autopsy on him. And Lou Gehrig was somebody that just played hurt. Something else that I admired about him was the fact that after he got sick and learned that he was going to be dying, he was forced to retire from baseball, but he spent the last 2 years of his life visiting a local prison, meeting with inmates and counseling them on how to turn their life around once they got out of prison. A newspaper reporter found out what he was doing, and he made that reporter promise that he would not put it in the paper. He was going to that prison to help people, not to get his name in print. And again, I'm sure he had issues. I'm sure he had problems. Heroes are one-dimensional. Lou Gehrig was a Catholic. Lou Gehrig probably was not saved. I'm not using him as a spiritual hero. I just use him to motivate me, to not whine and complain about things that may happen in my life. He played hurt. I'd say that's a good thing for all of us to try to do. If you were to walk into my office, I have the strangest picture on my wall. Have you ever heard of Jack LaLanne from a lot of years ago? He was a health nut, a health guru. He's the guy that really popularized going to the gym. I have a picture in my office of Jack LaLanne swimming, towing rowboats. When Jack LaLanne turned 70 years old, he wanted to prove that age is only a number. And so he swam across San Francisco Bay from Alcatraz to shore. He's 70 years old, handcuffed, and he's towing 70 rowboats behind him. And he swam. So what's the point? Age is only a number. Everybody hurts when you get older. But that's not a good reason to get sidelined. The man was getting up at 5 o'clock every morning and exercising for 2 hours. He lived into his 90s. So maybe we ought to think about paying the price so that we can stay productive and continue to do something for God. Turn, if you would, to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse number 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse number 2. I have heroes this morning who were in the military. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, the Bible there says, "And the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." And so here we find the Christian life being kind of made similar to being in the military. When the Persians began their invasion of Greece, they looked at all of the numbers on paper and it looked easy peasy. 1 million Persians going to invade Greece, and lo and behold, 300 Spartans show up to stop them? Are these Spartans crazy? Look at how it works out on paper. 1 million against 300. Well, there's something in life called intangibles. Things that don't always add up. Things that just kind of work out anyhow in some crazy fashion. And what the Persians didn't reckon on was King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans. Now, what kind of madman is going to lead 300 individuals to fight 1 million Persians? Well, there's this thing called Thermopylae Pass. And yeah, they were all wiped out, but they bought enough time for Greece to where the greatest victory at sea was won by the Greeks, and the Persians had to go back home. So what is it about Leonidas that would qualify him as one of my heroes? And he is one of my heroes. One thing I like about him is numbers didn't matter. To him, doing right was everything. You win, you lose, that's insignificant. The idea is, what's the right thing? And he was willing to fight and die for what he believed was to be right. And the second matter about him had to do with the right kind of attitude that he had. The Spartans are getting killed. The Persians, it's only a matter of time. Everybody knows that. So the Persians come up and they challenge Leonidas and they tell him that they need to lay down their weapons. And the reply of Leonidas was, "Come and take them." I like that attitude. Did he win? No. But winning wasn't the point. And by the way, the Lord has not called us to win either. He has called us to stand. He's called us to put down roots. Winning, losing, irrelevant. The matter is what's right. And right is the only thing that matters. But again, I stress, heroes, they're one-dimensional. And while you can look at some good qualities about King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, let's not forget that the Spartans were kind of guilty of brainwashing. They took the boys out of their home at age 7, stuck them in a military academy until they were like 21. They beat them, taught them how to steal to survive. A very harsh environment. They were lost individuals training their kids. The best kind of death you can have is to die for Sparta. And so, yeah, there's a whole lot of negative baggage. But all heroes have negative baggage. And all heroes have one thing that they excel at. Another hero of mine is a Navy pilot by the name of Butch O'Hare. O'Hare Airport's named after him. He was a Navy pilot flying off a carrier in World War II. He went off on a bombing mission. Somebody didn't fuel his aircraft properly. He was about to run out of gas, had to go back to the carrier. When he got back, he found 7 Japanese aircraft attacking the aircraft carrier. He chased them off with his airplane. He used up all the bullets that he could. When he didn't have any more bullets to shoot them, he's trying to ram them and chop their airplane up with his propeller. He looked like a maniac. And so the Japanese took off. He landed the airplane, ended up getting the Medal of Honor out of that. They sent him back to the States to drum up support for buying war bonds. He didn't like that, asked if he could go back to combat. He went back and he was killed, willing to sacrifice his life for his country. He was a Catholic, probably lost, but he still is a hero to me because he was willing to die in defense of his country. James chapter 1, verse number 8, if you would. Last category this morning, and this is a weird one. James chapter 1, verse number 8. I have heroes, believe it or not, who were politicians. Brother Holloway, you got to be kidding me. A politician who's a hero? Not many of them, but I have found a couple. James chapter 1, verse number 8. This is the motto of every politician. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And that describes Washington, D.C. and about every other place that has politicians. It describes the politicians of today, and yet it was not always like that. My first political hero is Winston Churchill. He was one of the most gifted speakers where speeches became a source of rallying the British people as they dared to stand alone against Hitler. After Britain declared war against Hitler for breaking his promise not to invade Poland, Churchill made his very first speech after becoming prime minister, and in part he said this: I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. When France was invaded, taken over, Churchill immediately had to inform the British people that all was not lost. And that's when he said, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. When so many pilots and air crews had been killed trying to defend England against the German Air Force, Churchill gave this stirring bit of information. He says, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. When Hitler was about to do his best to strike England with all that he could, Churchill prepared his people for the worst that was yet to come. And he said, let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. In spite of his many accomplishments, Churchill still had his share of enemies and detractors. There were people, we can look back now, he was a heroic figure. In his day, he was hated by a lot of people. One individual that despised him, a woman by the name of Nancy Astor. She was the first politician who was elected to Parliament. She made no bones about how much she disagreed with Churchill. She once made the remark to Churchill, if she was married to him, she would put poison in his tea. His remark to her was, if I was married to you, I'd drink it. My list of heroic politicians is a rather short list. But one more would include President Ronald Reagan, who had an uncommon insight into patriotism and what made America great. He said this: freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. He said government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. And probably my favorite is, He said that the 9 scariest words in the English language were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And who can forget Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The great thing about both of these men is that they were able to put into words the genuine convictions that they both held, and convictions in a politician is very rare. One last quote that I'll finish with, it was given by Ronald Reagan in relation to the American people who would be called just ordinary Americans. And he said, "Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes just don't know where to look." I will use those words in closing to encourage everyone here this morning to use those people that God has placed in our lives as a stepping stone to build and to develop our character. Our ultimate goal is to become like Christ. And for me, heroes have been a good way to identify my weaknesses while trying to do something about them. And I think Paul said it best when describing the benefit of having a lone ranger in your life. "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Let me share one thing and then we're done. A great hobby to acquire would be to look at people and instead of looking for a fault, find that one redeeming quality, something that you're not so good at and they're great at it. And allow that person next to you to become your hero. And your pastor should be at the top of the list. Let's bow for prayer. Father, we come before you asking that you would help us. You have allowed us to be part of a great church family. You've allowed us to become saved. And I pray that you'd help us to realize we are surrounded by so many good people, so many great qualities about them. And we ask and pray that you would allow the good qualities in that person's life to humble us. Would you please help us to realize we're all going to struggle. We're all going to have problems and issues to deal with. There's going to be so many temptations for us to just throw in the towel, to give up, to quit. But I pray, dear God, that you'd please help us to be wise enough to use other people that you've placed in our life. Help us to stay in the race. Help us to finish. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed. My first question this morning is, do we have anybody in the services this morning who's not 100% sure that you're going to heaven when you die? If you have the slightest doubt, it ought to be something that is investigated. If you're not 100% sure of going to heaven when you die, if you need to be saved, would you be willing to slip up your hand to acknowledge to Jesus Christ that you need salvation this morning? Would you slip up your hand? Do we have anybody like that? All right, let's all stand. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed. The music begins to play. The altar is open. If God has spoken to your heart, you ought to respond to the Holy Spirit. We invite you to come. Would you come?